Hello and welcome to Africa Here and Now, the conversation you've always wanted to have about the continent. I'm Martine Dennis. Today, is the West African bloc Ecowas at risk of disintegration as Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger leave and form a rival group? Have the achievements of Kenya's Gen Z protesters inspired other young people on the continent? They got the president to withdraw his unpopular tax bill. We asked Hopewell Chin'ono, renowned Zimbabwean journalist and activist, about the youth in his country. Sierra Leone's government spends big on its schools. Education Minister Comrade Saki tells us about an app that's helping him collect essential information about teachers and students. And a new government in London. Keir Starmer's team say they want to re-engage with Africa. What could that mean for the continent? I was joined by Patrick Smith, editor of Africa Confidential, as usual, and we were exceedingly fortunate to have the company of the veteran international broadcaster, Veronique Edwards, to help unpack these issues. We started with ECOWAS, which had been meeting to try to work out what to do about the 3 Sahelian states who want to quit the 15-member bloc and who've now formed a new group of their own, the Alliance of Sahel States. Omar Touré, the head of the ECOWAS Commission, said it was now at risk of disintegration. We got hold of Adam Gaye, former ECOWAS Communications Director, and Paul MELLY, journalist and consulting fellow at the think tank Chatham House. Adama, starting with you, do you think that ECOWAS is in danger of disintegrating?
It is an organization that has been truly working near the abyss for many years. And now it is really facing a death threat because for the first time ever since its creation on May 28, 1975, is the first time that we have seen the organization losing very important members of its founding states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. So it is a serious threat.
But they are only 3 states, leaving 12 states in ECOWAS, including the big states like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana.
Yes, indeed. If you look at the organization, at one point it was 16 member states, including Mauritania. Now, those countries that are working within the organization are 11 because Guinea-Conakry is not allowed to sit on meetings because it is ruled by military regime. What has happened over the past few years has been the fact that, one, the leadership quality among its member states has been very poor. They have not been very coherent between their statement for democracy and their practice of bad governance and autocracy. Most of these countries are ruled by people who have won election through really dubious manners. So, last but not the least, the reality of the organization is that it's financially very weak. The commission doesn't have the capacity to run, and on the delivery level, whether about trade within West Africa or in the promotion of good governance, rule of law, and the implementation of its institutions like the Court of Justice, ECOWAS has been missing. So the reality is that at this stage, with the weak leadership it has, and the fact that it is being really saddled with a lot of insecurity challenges, jihadists all over the region, and really a rejection of the organization's name by many people within the region. The organization has the responsibility, the duty, the urgent duty to address its identity crisis, but also its future. And now I believe that next year will be ECOWAS's 50th anniversary, is the time to do so.
And Paul, do you agree with Adama? Adama seems to be suggesting that a lot of the fault lies with ECOWAS itself.
I think it's certainly true that a lot of the fault does lie with ECOWAS itself, particularly with those leaders who have been quite hypocritical, quite cynical in, for example, not living up to their constitutional democratic rules. And we've had examples, even just in the last 2 or 3 months, in Togo, in the middle of a regional crisis, the Togolese government cynically forced through a constitutional revamp, basically to allow Faure to remain in power indefinitely. And we've obviously seen abuses of that sort of kind in other countries, but I'm not sure that we should regard this as the end of the road for ECOWAS. I think Adama is right to suggest that this is a moment of truth, a moment of crisis, but ECOWAS has been realistic in recognizing ultimately that it can't use force or sanctions to bring the Sahelian states back into the group. So somehow it has to make itself more attractive. It has to make itself a bloc that ultimately, when the Sahelian states have perhaps gone through several more years of political difficulty, military rule, perhaps eventually political change, that it is attractive to rejoin ECOWAS. And that means actually strengthening not just the governance rules, but also the economic structures. Really, there was a very interesting article written by the journalist Howard French a few months ago, where he pointed out that the West African coastal strip, basically between southern Nigeria and Abidjan, will in 20 years' time, I think, have a population of 450 million. Now, whether the figures are accurate or not, his basic point was that this has the potential to be one of the new great emerging economy zones of the world because of the concentration of the population and the fact that relatively small development investment in infrastructure, railways, roads, etc., could deeply integrate it. So ECOWAS has to make itself something that people want to join.
Adama, bonjour. I wanted to ask you a question about the ideology of the junta leaders, because they claim to be the sort of hefty nationalist, Pan-Africanists. But what they're doing by breaking away from ECOWAS is actually splitting the possibility of a united Africa, it seems. I mean, they're heading in the wrong direction, surely. And how does that go down with the people on the West African street?
Yeah, people are somehow happy about this development. They have been looking for an alternative way in order to get away from these organizations that are really under the control of the French, form of a neocolonialism. What is happening now is this. ECOWAS made this problem for itself. Remember last year, on July 26, 2023, when there was the military coup in Niger, all ECOWAS did, they jumped on all tables and shouted loud that, okay, we are going to reinstate the ousted president, Mr. Bazoum, who had been re-elected on dubious manners once again. And also they said, ECOWAS, if that is not done in less than 1 month, we are going to send military forces. That created, first of all, a greater rift between them and Niger and brought together the military regime who are saying, who are the civilian leaders who do not respect rule of law, who are not democrat by themselves, to advise us.
And Vero, what are your thoughts?
Well, Mr. Adam Gaye, you've said everything that is on the minds of a lot of people on the streets of these ECOWAS countries, and Niger, Mali, and Burkina going out of it in a way. It's an indication that people are fed up. They need results. They need implementation of ideas, and not just sitting on the fence and blaming people left, right, and center. But my question now is, the three countries that have now moved themselves out of this equation, can they go on their own, and what should their people expect? Can they deliver, or are they still going to have excuses because their finances, their economic situation, and their military situation is being tied to the largesse of the French or other governments around the world, that they do go with their begging bowls to go and ask for help?
Look, these countries, if you look at their landmass, they are literally wider than Europe. Mali is over 1 million kilometers square. Niger, 1,267,000 kilometers square. Same for Burkina Faso. These are big states. Don't underestimate their capacity. They are resource rich. and they have the resolve. I'm not in favor of them really going their own way, but when you look at it, they have some aspect for themselves. Beyond that, on June 2016, when Britain decided, the UK, to leave the European Union, who expected it to be able to stand by itself? You know, this is not about a region of, at this moment, 400 million inhabitants. Maybe even Nigeria would be over 400 million by the end of this century. So this is a big region. But if you look at these three states, with also the support of the population in West Africa and also the global trend, the geopolitics, whereby people are saying we need to have our sovereignty. We need to cut off our ties with the colonial powers, the French being always in charge of what is going on in the region. That makes it an attractive proposition. And many are saying that you should continue because you are opening a new day. And I want to point a last aspect. ECOWAS is suffering also because of the bureaucracy that is stifling it within inside. These bureaucrats, I've known them well, having worked with them inside. They are only interested in per diems, in travels. They are not there for the vision that the founding fathers had when they created ECOWAS. So there is not a question for the three member states, but the question for ECOWAS. If ECOWAS becomes a powerful force, people will come.
Thank you for that, Adam. And let me just get Paul's impression of the task that has been given to the new president of Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye. He's been made special envoy. He's got the task of trying to persuade the Sahelian Three to come back into the fold. Is that a fool's errand, would you say?
I don't think it's a fool's errand, but it's interesting that in the summit yesterday, he put some hard truths on the table. And he said, we can't have any more constitutional changes. We actually have to overhaul, modernize. We've got to stick to the rules. Then we might have some chance eventually of drawing these countries back in. ECOWAS has to make itself more attractive. And at the same time, the Sahelian countries, they're landlocked. They do have resources, but they also face huge problems. And I think ECOWAS trying to hold open the door to show a welcoming posture, but while actually sorting out its internal problems is probably the most realistic way forward.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Adam Gaye talking to us from Dakar. Thank you, Adama, and Paul MELLY for taking us through the travails of West Africa. Thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much.
Let's start talking about Kenya, shall we? Let's start with the amazing scenes that we've witnessed in Kenya, not just in Nairobi, but all around the country, where the young people took their complaints to the street. Their protests were successful ultimately, and they forced President Ruto to withdraw this hideous tax bill that was so unpopular. Just extraordinary scenes, and we're still absorbing the effects of that.
Yes, Martin, there were extraordinary scenes. I've never seen so many people pour out onto the streets, even during the last elections. I never saw so many youths in their masses. The streets were darkened just with the population of these students and young people. They came out because they were really outrageously angered by what President Ruto had decided to do. And before this, they had said this bill was unpopular. But what was amazing was the fact that they still went to Parliament to vote for this bill. And on the first day, these people, the youth, everybody went out, regardless of party affiliation or ethnicity. They all went out to show their anger because most of them are jobless. They're roaming the streets, they need jobs. And President Ruto had promised that the hustler, the street vendor, the bike person, the vegetable seller on the street was going to be given an enabling environment to thrive and do things for themselves during his campaigns. And it appears he had completely forgotten the promises he made. So to claw back to pay the IMF loan, the World Bank, and all the other financial institutions that government was owing, they decided to increase the taxes to the anger of the young people who were now, most of them looking for jobs and couldn't find them. And we're talking of people under 35 years old, and they make up 70% of the population. So they said, no, enough is enough. We are going to get what we truly deserve. So they went out. And remember, this is Generation Z. They are more educated and they know how to form themselves together to say, we are here, we've landed, you have to listen to us.
And Patrick, Vera makes an important point, doesn't she, when she refers to the fact that traditional lines of ethnicity have been blurred and it hardly counts anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Yusuf Hassan, who's an MP from Kamakunji in Nairobi, and he was making the point that even at the height of opposition mobilization in the 80s and 90s against the regime of Daniel Arap Moi, they could only ever get 2 or 3 demonstrations a day in 2 or 3 places around the country, like, you know, Nairobi and Nakuru and Mombasa. But these organizations, the Gen Z organization protests, they managed to get 35 demonstrations in the counties, in the 47 counties of the country on that one day. So, yeah, it was a tremendous moment. And it wasn't just the sort of middle-class professionals that did this. This was right across the society. So I think it's a really powerful movement that they've established. I mean, the question is, where do they take it from here? Because, you know, the next demand is, okay, we've got rid of the finance bill. We want to get rid of Ruto now.
Well, their achievement in getting that bill rescinded has been hailed far and wide. And we really want to know how these scenes have resonated among other young people on the continent. And then I came across this.
This is a special message to all Zimbabwean youths. You are in the majority. Voting is the only way that you can make yourself successful, properly heard. Otherwise, the suffering continues if you don't register to vote. So we need to fix the hospitals, the roads, the jobs, the schools, the drinking water that comes out dirty every day, the drugs, the pandemic that is driving our youth mental, the repression, the violence, the abductions, the captured state, institutions that are used to silence us. Now this is a message to all the youths out there. Listen up. Tinashe, Mnyasha, Fadzai, Nelson, Tafara, Petsai, Udakwashe, Mamoyo, Msaigwa, Mfuiwa, Samaita, Mandlovu, Mandebele, Humba. We have to go out there and register to vote. That is the only way we're gonna change our future. This country is in trouble from the looting, the plunder, the incompetence, the nepotism.
Well, that was the renowned Zimbabwean journalist and activist Hopewell Chin'ono, and he's joining us now from Johannesburg. Hopewell, I know you're a man of many talents, but you're also a good rapper.
Thank you so much for having me. I didn't realize I had that talent until I got fed up with corruption in Zimbabwe.
Did you practice a lot?
No, it was actually, I was bored on a Sunday. I'd just come from prison after my 3rd arrest for exposing corruption. And I just did a challenge for young people because I realized that in order to engage with young people, you have got to do the things that they relate to. And music is one of those things, as we saw even in Kenya, that music was part of the demonstrations in order to conscientize the young people about the issues that are affecting them on a day-to-day basis.
But the message of your video in particular is really about getting young people, this Gen Z cohort, to register to vote and then to use their vote. How important is that within the Zimbabwean context?
Well, it was important because what then happened was there were thousands of people that were turning up at voter registration stations in Harare and outside Harare. The problem is that as part of rigging elections, as all of you would know, you've covered Africa, part of rigging elections involves making it difficult for voters to register. And that's what the Zimbabwean government was doing They were making it difficult for people in urban areas, which are bastions for the opposition, to go and register. They had only 2 offices for Harare, which has residents exceeding 3 million, to go and register to vote. So it was impossible for young people to actually go there, register to vote, and go back home. So that song then went viral, and it encouraged a lot of other people to come forward, provide money for transport for the young people to go and register to vote. Because in Zimbabwe, like many other places in Africa, or rather all other places in Africa, the young are in the majority, and the young are demanding and pushing for change. And the only way we thought change could come was through an election. So when we had these huge numbers that had registered to vote after that push, the government then did other things to make sure that the vote doesn't count.
And why is it, because it does appear, Hopewell, as though the young people of Zimbabwe are not particularly exercised about the level of corruption? You and others have documented the extraordinary industrial nature of the corruption in Zimbabwe, but the people of Zimbabwe, the youth in particular, they don't seem to be particularly bothered by it, or they're not protesting about it anyway.
I think, like Kenya in the 90s, the current Zimbabwean political environment involves a government that is very draconian. When people went to the streets in 2018 in August, 6 people were killed. In 2019 in January, more people were killed again when they protested against the rise in fuel prices. And the other problem that we have is that Zimbabwe is where Nigeria was in the 80s and 90s. Zimbabwe is probably now one of the most corrupt countries in Africa. I'll give you a good example. Something that costs 50 cents, someone is given a tender by government, and they charge the government $30 for something that costs only 50 cents. And we now have a situation where people are fighting to be included on the feeding trough rather than pushing away and fighting corruption. So the systematic corruption in the whole country now, such that even the maid who's working for you in your home is prepared to steal something from your home and sell it, and they see nothing wrong with that. So we have got a lot of work to do in order to stop that. Work that involves educating people to understand that when this money is stolen from the public coffers, it is the reason why they do not have good roads. It is the reason why they have electricity load shedding, like what's happening in most of Southern Africa today. It is the reason why they do not have hospitals. Some of the political elites in the opposition have failed to really demonstrate this to the citizens, and to ignite the anger in them that we saw in Kenya. And I think what's going to end up happening in countries like Zimbabwe is the same thing that happened in Kenya, where people do not wait for political formations, but just come together as a group of interested citizens who are fed up of something and they fight.
Hopewell, what about the international organizations? I mean, the IMF has been in Zimbabwe recently and said a couple of strange things about the economy, one of which it claimed that the new Zimbabwe gold currency, which many are fairly skeptical about, they said that it had stabilized over the last 3 months. I wonder what you think about the international engagement with Zimbabwe right now.
I think most of the engagement now is shaped by the international political maneuvers by the superpowers. So you find that the IMF will say certain things that we find weird. Like, for instance, they said our GDP is $48 billion. And when you look at where they're getting those figures, you find out that they're using government figures that are cooked. And also, in terms of re-engagement or engagement with the international community, Western countries that used to put a lot of pressure, for instance, European countries and Britain, which is a former colonizer, have sort of pulled back because when you speak to them privately, they tell you that they are worried by the influence that China has in Africa and particularly Zimbabwe. So they say they are trying to avoid a situation where the ZANU-PF regime is embraced by Beijing, and it ignores any engagement with Western countries at all. I remember reading an American economist, Steve Hank, who has been measuring Zimbabwean inflation accurately since 2017. He now calls ZANU-PF a criminal enterprise because of all these things that we have seen. And some of it is caused by Britain after Brexit. The attitude of Britain towards certain things has changed because they do not have the contracts and arrangements that they had when they were in the EU. So they are having to go out to their former colonies to come up with some kind of business contracts for things like mining. Zimbabwe's got lithium, Zimbabwe's got gold. So in order to get those deals, they are having to bend over and allow things that in a normal day in a Western country are not allowed.
And this is altogether very, very depressing. But in this oppressive environment, how do you expect to get young people to engage politically, to have civic engagement?
It is very difficult in Zimbabwe to do that. You will remember that for just doing my work as a journalist, I was thrown into prison 3 times inside 6 months. And this was done not necessarily just to punish me, but to send a strong message to other people that if you behave in the way that he's behaving, we are going to throw you into prison. We don't care of his international stature. We don't care that he's worked with the BBC or ITV News before. We are going to throw him into prison and nothing is going to happen to us. And when you speak to young people, especially journalists, young people in the media, they tell you that we are afraid to cover some of the stories that we come across because we'll be thrown into prison. And the same thing applies to the ordinary young people in townships in Zimbabwe because they are there. The majority of young people are in our townships. There is violence that is used against them by party apparatus. There is violence that is used against them by the police and the military. And because of that, they are timid, they are scared. The opposition has been driven into a corner where most of the leadership are either captured by ZANU-PF or they're scared. Right now, we've got a former government minister from the GNU who has been in prison since the 16th of June. His name is Jameson Timber. He was arrested with 78 other young people. He had asked them to come to his home to celebrate the 1976 Youth Day. And he was arrested because they said you are bringing in people to your house. You are trying to indoctrinate them so that they can go on the streets. So when people see this, that people have been arrested for almost 3 weeks now, they've not been given bail, they not think twice before they go into the streets. But the thing is that we have seen across the continent and around the world is that once people remove that fear and they become courageous and they go on the streets, things change quickly.
Hopewell, let me just chip in there. With this campaign of yours encouraging people to go out and register in masses and to vote, and the scenario you've painted now, if people are so afraid to do that, how do you think they would do on being able to go and vote and exercise their right to choose the right people to govern them?
Well, you're very right, Veronique, because when I started the campaign for young people to register to vote, they were despondent about all those elements that you talked about. Eventually, many people went out to register to vote, and their vote didn't count. Just last week, the commander of the Zimbabwean army, General Namo Sanyatwa, came out and said that we are not going to allow a situation where the country is going to be ruled by a different group of people based on a ball pen. And he said that they are going to use what he called command voting, which is what you said in a different way by saying that they are told who to vote for. And they are told that if they don't do that, they are going to suffer the consequences. There is a big problem of fear that young people have to overcome. But the other problem that we face is that we have an opposition that is weak. We have an opposition that's not robust, that is scared. And we have opposition politicians that are prepared to cut deals with ZANU-PF if it means they are making money. And we've seen that happening. So at the moment, if you ask me, voting in Zimbabwe, it's after what happened in August 2023 when we went to the polls. A lot of young people are now saying voting is useless, voting is pointless. We need to do other things. We need to go on the streets. When they ask the opposition whether it's ready to lead them, the opposition says no. The main opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, said, no, I'm not prepared to go on the streets because people will be killed, which means we are in a situation where voting doesn't work and the opposition is scared to go on the streets. So the only alternative left now is what happened in Kenya, where a group of people or who are not led by a well-known opposition leader go onto the streets and they demand change. And I think the only alternative left in Zimbabwe is for people to come out on the streets, have peaceful demonstrations, because this is allowed under our Constitution, Section 59. It allows for peaceful demonstrations to take place, but ZANU-PF is extremely terrified of people being on the streets.
Hopewell Chin'ono, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right, we can turn to Sierra Leone. The government there has made education one of its top priorities. Attending school in a country where less than half of the adult population is literate is now recognised as a right for every child. And this has led to a big increase in school enrolment. But how to monitor and manage these education initiatives that account for more than 20% of Sierra Leone's national budget. Well, there's a British company, CGA Technologies, that's developed an app called withdrawn, and I'm sure that my pronunciation of that is going to be rectified by Vero and indeed Minister Conrad Saki, who we're very lucky is joining us from Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this program. Your pronunciation of the Creole word, which stands for "we are here," is excellent.
Really? Vero's laughing at me. Okay, so tell us about this app, first of all, Minister Saki. Tell us what the app actually does.
Okay, we have invested a significant amount of money into education in Sierra Leone. You've mentioned the fact that our educational funding is 22% of our budget. Just last year, we increased it by another 1%. So we have seen an increase of about 1 million additional learners, which accounts for about 33% increase. Now, we want to make sure that that money is well spent. And so this app is there to monitor the attendance of both learners and teachers. It also provides some further information on these learners, for example, their disability status. And from what we have seen from the first pilot that we started last year, targeting about 300 primary schools, and we were able to collect data on about 98,000 individual learners and 3,300 teachers. What we came up with was that our payroll teachers, 51% of them were not teaching in their allocated schools or not teaching at all. So there are two aspects. If they're not teaching in our allocated schools, obviously it has an impact in terms of the teacher-pupil ratio, and the possibility of an increase or overcrowding of our classrooms. And if they are not teaching at all, then the treasury is losing out. And we also noticed that 1,169 payroll teachers had been transferred to other schools. So they're in the system, but transferred to other schools without authorization from the regulatory authorities. Now, with this information, we have the opportunity to have a course correct, and also be able to make some adjustments and address those issues.
So the more information, the more accurate information you have, the better able you are to serve the people. But what about the cost effectiveness of this? I mean, how are you measuring that?
Well, if we make some brief calculations on cost effectiveness, what we have noticed is that if we clean up the payroll of just the numbers that I mentioned earlier on, we could make a savings of 1.2 million leones, which is the equivalent of 57,000 US dollar every month. And this is a small pilot. So we know that if we scale up and address the issues that we've found, we'll be in a better position to provide a more effective and more efficient educational services.
And Vero?
I was just wondering, you have this very lofty idea of helping a lot of thousands of children to go to school. My problem with this is how well informed are they that this is going to help them? How are you going to convince them from going to the farms to eke out a living by farming and surely knowing that they can have food to help themselves, as to going back to a school where they have to provide for school fees, their uniforms, their books, traveling, name it?
Well, thank you very much for that, because in 2018, when the government came into power, it introduced a pro-poor policy called the free quality school education. First of all, tuition is free. There is also free teaching and learning materials. There is also free examination fees. We also have a school feeding program targeting over 800,000 pupils. We also provide school health. So we are just about to embark upon a procurement process where every school will have first aid kits and trained staff to actually administer if needed. We also, in the case of those learners that have disabilities, we are also providing assistive technologies to those. For the girl child, we are also providing menstrual kits for the girl child so that they come to school when they experience their periods. So it is these poor policies and initiatives that have benefited these young people, and that's why we've seen that 1 million increase.
And Patrick?
Thanks very much for explaining how this works, Minister, and congratulations on the project. I just wonder, I mean, using this technology, which essentially is a sort of budgetary financial technology, is there scope to widen the application of the technology to get a better sense of how the students are benefiting from this tuition?
Well, I think there are two aspects to it. I think in the first, for us, we see it as a game changer. And let me just share with you why I think that is the case. Because first, it has helped us to know who and where our learners and teachers are. And the benefits of that is that we are able to track movement of our teachers and learners across schools over time. The second is that it has helped to improve payroll integrity by identifying mismatches between the teachers on the payroll and the actual reality. Thirdly, it has also helped us to regulate unauthorized teacher absences and transfers. Fourthly, it has helped us to capture data on non-payroll teachers, because we do have a significant number of teachers who are volunteer teachers. It has also helped us to verify school subsidies based on the accurate learner count. And lastly, it has also helped us to ensure supply and qualification of teachers meet the demands and needs of our learners. It also empowers our school leaders to control teacher attendance and manage school data. And lastly, it also helps to mitigate and flag up learner dropouts. Now, if we notice that learners are not turning up, there might be reasons for that. It's important that we provide some form of support and to find out why that is the case. Our guidance and counselors who we are about to introduce into the system will now check on those learners to make sure that they provide the adequate support to deal with whatever their needs are.
And finally, Minister, how do you actually collect the data?
Oh, well, we are providing schools with tablets. So the school leaders in each of the schools will have one tablet. And this app will be uploaded onto the tablet. So what happens is the register of teachers is actually done by biodata. So they use their thumbprint to register in the school. The app also has a GPS coordinate, so we know that the register is actually done in the particular school that we expect of those teachers. And once that data is provided, it's stored on a cloud-based database. The good thing about it also is that it has a dashboard. So for education managers and even myself, we can access this data. And I can sit in my office and see what's actually happening in our schools. For other education managers, they can now use that information to send in school quality assurance officers to investigate the trends that we are seeing on the dashboard. In the wider context, what we want to be able to see is to provide an effective and efficient system. Now, when I sit on the cabinet table and I am in control of 22% of the budget, you can imagine what my colleagues will think about me, and I need to be able to justify how I'm using that 22%. But more importantly, it is important that the citizens of Sierra Leone know exactly how the government is spending that 22%. And that's how we would assess the success of it.
Minister Comrade Saki, Sierra Leone's Education Minister, thank you so much indeed for explaining that to us. It was really interesting to hear how tech is being used in such a variety of ways. Quite recently, we were talking about AI in Malawi, for instance. And so it was really interesting to hear how you're using tech in Sierra Leone. Comrade Saki, thank you very much.
Thank you.
By now, I'm sure you all know that there is a new occupant in number 10 Downing Street. Keir Starmer and his revamped and rebooted Labour Party have made it back into government after 14 years in opposition. Patrick, therefore, we've got a new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. He's been zipping around Europe, hasn't he? And he is going to Washington. There's a big NATO summit this week. So clearly, the foreign policy priorities are Europe, obviously Ukraine and Gaza. But there's talk of this re-engaging with Africa. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's a couple of big things for the government, the new Labour government, remodeled Labour government under Keir Starmer and David Lammy. One is climate, and they have to do some big things on climate. And they're already, as you say, Lammy has been to see his German counterpart, Baerbock, in Berlin. He's been to Poland. He's been to Sweden. And at least the German and the Swedish trips were partly about climate things and climate finance. There are a couple of very important meetings coming up on that at the UN. There's a so-called Summit of the Future. So I think one of the priorities they've got to sort out is the whole issue of climate finance, development finance, and so on. So under the Tory government, they split up. They sort of merged the old Department of International Development with the Foreign Office, and they've also cut development finance quite a lot. And they've been fairly tight-fisted when it comes to climate finance. So the story with the new government is they're going to be a lot more open-minded about this and a lot more engaged and a lot more kind of creative, trying to bring some of the big private sector players in to work alongside government to put more out on climate finance. So that's quite an important deal as well. And then you've got a kind of a corpus of labor activists from the African diaspora who are kind of urging this new Labour government to take a much more serious and kind of joined up approach to Africa than the predecessor Tory government. There's a woman some of you would know called Miata Fambule, who is an MP, a London MP, and she fled the Liberian Civil War and has been one of the leading academics at the LSE, started something called the New Economics Foundation, and been running that. And she's going to be one of the big advisors to the government. There's another African diaspora academic called David Luke, who's based now at the LSE. He's been advising the government. So I think the government will have a better connection with the African diaspora, particularly on the issues of development finance and so on. And Lame, as you say, has got a lot of other issues on his plate, such as Gaza and Ukraine. But he has said that he is going to really focus on the African diaspora. He's actually from the Caribbean, from Guyana, and he has a lot of friends in the African diaspora. And he said one of his pitches is we need to join up much more. So I think he will find himself also quite tight with some of the more progressive voices in Europe who want a closer relationship with Africa and to start sort of telling a more constructive story about migration and how to work much more closely with African governments and the African activist community.
Thank you, Patrick. That's it for this edition of Africa Here and Now. Now, this is a bit where I try to drum up support for the podcast. If you're enjoying our conversations, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share with everyone you know, and I mean everyone. www.africahereandnow.com is our website, where you can catch up on all our past episodes and find out more about us. We're available on all major audio platforms as well as on your smart speaker. Follow us on the socials, Instagram, Facebook. I'm on X at Martine Dennis. I've even ventured onto TikTok recently. Do get in touch. Martine at Africa Here and Now. We recorded this on Monday, July the 8th, 2024. Our producer is Anne Busby. Our original music is by Enric Adam. Anna DeWolf Evans and Charlie Panton put everything together. Our thanks to our guests, Paul and Adama, Minister Conrad Saki, and Hopewell. From Patrick, Veronique and me, thank you for your company.